My name is Ardan Hail. I'm 34, and people say I move through spaces like I've already mapped the exits before taking a breath. That instinct came from years of training, first in the military, where hesitation could cost lives, and later as an auditor in a Manhattan skyscraper, where hesitation cost money. Precision became my comfort. Order, my armor. Numbers were easier to trust than promises, and ink on paper never flinched under pressure. 11 years had passed since I last saw Columbus, since I'd driven away under a grey dawn with 2 worn suitcases and a scholarship that felt like a ticket out of purgatory. I swore I'd never return, never again hear the gravel crunch of Maple Street beneath my boots. But the universe doesn't honor vows made in bitterness. One phone call shattered that distance, the fragile voice of my grandmother, trembling through static, saying Grandpa had taken his final breath. Her tone wasn't a request, it was a command wrapped in grief. Within hours, I was on a plane heading west, watching clouds drift beneath the wing as if they could soften the dread coiled in my gut. My carry-on wasn't filled with comfort or sentiment, just folders, wills, contracts, the kind of papers that made sense when nothing else did. When I arrived, the old house looked smaller, almost fragile. The white paint had peeled like shedding skin, shutters drooping, the porch sagging in surrender. The garden where Grandma once grew marigolds was nothing but brittle stems and soil hardened with neglect. I paused at the bottom of the steps, letting the wind stir the dust, trying to steady my heartbeat that thudded louder than I wanted to admit. The front door creaked open. Ardan, my mother's voice fractured on my name. She pulled me close before I could speak, her arms trembling. She smelled of cigarette smoke mixed with lavender lotion, the same kind she used when I was a child. Her tears dampened my collar, and for one impossible moment, it felt like time had folded in on itself, like maybe forgiveness could live in this air. Then his shadow appeared behind her. My father. The same broad shoulders, the same storm in his eyes. "Welcome back," he muttered, words soaked in bourbon. Before I could reply, his fist struck my face. The impact sent heat rushing through my jaw, a flash of light behind my eyes. Humiliation landed heavier than pain. My mother flinched but didn't move, her gaze finding the floor, her silence screaming louder than his anger ever had. I straightened slowly, every instinct urging me to retreat, but I didn't. The years had changed more than the walls. My fingers brushed the strap of my bag, the weight of the documents inside grounding me. Each page a weapon forged from truth, proof that he couldn't rewrite history this time. "This isn't your house anymore," he hissed, voice rough with resentment. I met his stare without a word. The air between us thickened, carrying ghosts of old arguments and long-buried memories. Then I stepped forward, past him, into the narrow hallway that once echoed with childhood laughter. The smell hit me first, smoke, mildew, and something sour, like secrets left too long in the dark. The wallpaper had bubbled and peeled, family portraits hung crooked, faces trapped behind dust and time. At the end of the corridor, the study door stood half open. Inside, the light flickered weakly, illuminating stacks of unpaid bills and empty bottles. A photo of my younger self still sat on the desk, framed in tarnished brass. Someone had scratched a corner of the glass. I exhaled, the sound catching in my throat. 11 years gone, and somehow, the house had held its breath, waiting for a reckoning. And now, it had arrived with me. The corridor felt narrower than memory allowed, its dimness pressing inward as though the house itself resented illumination. The sconces, once bright with warm halogen, now flickered weakly, bleeding a jaundiced light that barely reached the ceiling. Shadows gathered in the corners, pooling like ink, hiding the familiar shapes I used to know by heart. The walls were bare where our history had once lived, no smiles, no frames, no trace of who we'd been before the fractures began. In place of my father's photograph, him standing straight-backed in pressed uniform, that forced pride shining through, hung a deer's head, preserved and hollow. Its antlers stretched wide, sharp and cold under the wavering light. The glassy eyes seemed alive, accusing, as if they recognized me and found me wanting. My stomach tightened with an old dread, one I thought I'd buried far from Maple Street. Each step forward stirred the dust, a soft crunch beneath my soles, the boards beneath creaking in protest. The once polished flooring, the same oak my father had labored over with stubborn perfection, had turned dull and sticky, years of neglect varnishing it with grime. My reflection in the floor was nothing but a distorted silhouette. The air carried a heaviness, a sour cocktail of stale tobacco, spilled liquor, and something faintly metallic. It pressed into my lungs until every breath felt like swallowing ghosts. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked unevenly, its rhythm erratic, like a faltering heart. Ardan. My mother's voice reached me from behind, unsteady and small, each syllable trembling under the weight of years unspoken. It's been a long time. Things change. I turned toward her, catching the briefest flicker of recognition before she looked away. Her eyes, once clear and bright with laughter, now seemed washed out, like someone had drained the color from them. The gesture, her gaze dropping to the floor, cut deeper than the fresh bruise on my face. She fidgeted with her shirt, smoothing invisible wrinkles, fingers shaking slightly. It was the same nervous motion she used to make when she lied about bruises or excuses. She murmured something to herself, half a whisper swallowed by the air, then reached for a cigarette from the pocket of her apron but thought better of it, letting her hand fall limply to her side. The silence between us swelled until it filled the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, struggling, like it too had grown old and tired. I wanted to say something, to ask why the walls were bare, why the deer's eyes felt like judgment, but my throat stayed tight. Words felt dangerous here. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel, lined with memories that refused to fade completely. I could almost see echoes of the past: Dad's boots by the door, Mom's laughter on Sunday mornings, the faint smell of cinnamon rolls she used to bake when things were good. But every ghost dissolved as soon as I blinked, replaced by the stale, empty quiet that had taken their place. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the roughness where paint had bubbled, where time had chewed through the surface. My fingers brushed a nail still jutting out, the last remnant of a frame that once held our family frozen in better years. I wondered if she'd taken the photos down herself, or if he had ripped them off in some drunken rage. Mom shifted behind me, the floor creaking under her weight. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly, barely audible. Her words weren't cruel, just resigned, like she'd already accepted that hope was something this house no longer had room for. I glanced back toward the living room. Dust hung in the air, moving slowly through the light. Everything here felt smaller, meaner, like the walls themselves had been taught to keep secrets. I took another step forward, into the dark, and for the first time since stepping through that door, I realized it wasn't the house that had changed the most. It was her. Through the doorway, I froze. The living room looked smaller, almost suffocating, its air thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. He sat there, sprawled across the old recliner that had once been my father's throne, his kingdom inside four tired walls. That chair had been sacred once, a place of rare peace where I used to sit beside him on quiet Sundays, my legs barely reaching the edge, the television flickering with slow-moving football games and the low hum of his commentary. Now, it was barely recognizable. The worn leather had been stripped away and replaced with rough camouflage fabric, frayed at the seams, stained with the ghosts of too many nights like this. The man who occupied it looked like an echo of someone I used to fear, only heavier, his shoulders sinking into the cushions as though the weight of his choices had finally caught up to him. His hair, once neatly trimmed, hung uneven and dull, threaded with grey that glinted under the dim light. He didn't bother to rise, didn't even straighten. Instead, his fingers coiled around the neck of a beer bottle as though it were an anchor holding him steady in his own decay. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said finally, his voice rolling across the room like thunder, loud, deliberate, demanding obedience. It wasn't a greeting. It was a claim of territory. The sound filled every corner, made the walls seem closer. He leaned back slightly, chin tilted up, like a man who believed he still owned everything he'd already destroyed. I kept my silence, jaw locked tight, the words forming like sparks at the back of my throat but never catching flame. Instead, I let my eyes move across the room, searching for remnants of what used to be ours. The built-in shelves he once crafted with such care had vanished, replaced by mismatched units of cheap particle board bowing under the weight of dusty antlers, rusted lures, and plastic trophies, symbols of smaller victories, hollow ones. The walls were bare but for a single flag tacked up crookedly, its fabric torn along the edges. The smell of grease and old smoke hung over everything, seeping into the furniture. Even the carpet bore dark rings where bottles had been dropped and forgotten. Through the window, I saw the yard, or what remained of it. The basketball hoop that once stood proud beside the driveway was gone, leaving only a concrete scar. I could almost hear the echo of my 13-year-old self cheering when Dad had bolted it into place, the sound of rubber hitting asphalt, the laughter that used to carry through the summer air. All of it erased. Where my mother's garden used to bloom in wild bursts of color, roses and marigolds framing neat rows of tomato plants, there was now only gravel, uneven and lifeless. The soil that had once smelled of rain and green things now looked like ash. Each detail struck harder than the last, the sum of 1,000 small surrenders. The home I'd left behind wasn't just neglected, it had been rewritten, stripped of everything tender and replaced with the emptiness of habit and resentment. But underneath the ache, something steadier began to stir. Not rage, though it hummed low in my chest. Not pity, though I could feel its shadow brushing against me. It was resolve, cold, deliberate, unshakable. The kind that comes from seeing the truth stripped of nostalgia. This wasn't the house I'd grown up in. It was a grave built from memories that refused to stay buried. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't come back to mourn. I'd come back to reclaim what was left. Resentment, yes, but threaded through it was something colder, sharper. Resolve. The kind that doesn't shout or shake but hums quietly beneath the skin, waiting. The documents inside my bag were my insurance, tangible proof that not every claim here could be rewritten or burned away. Each signature, each clause, was a small fortress against the chaos that once ruled these walls. My hand lingered on the strap, feeling the weight of it press into my palm, grounding me. Across the room, he lounged in my father's chair, that lazy grin spreading like oil across his face. He thought silence meant surrender. Let him believe that. For now. I turned away, the floor groaning beneath my shoes, the boards bending like they, too, wanted to speak. As I reached the staircase, a cool draft snaked down from above, brushing my cheek like a warning. The steps creaked underfoot, each one heavier, slower, echoing through the hollow house like a countdown. Dust motes swirled in the air, catching the dim light as if the house itself exhaled with my movement. At the landing, I paused, my hand on the banister smooth from years of touch, his, hers, mine. I remembered running up these same stairs barefoot as a kid, laughter chasing me, Mom yelling for me to slow down. Now, that sound existed only in the back of my mind, faint and unreachable. The space between us, between who I had been and who I was now, felt impossible to cross. I drew in a breath, bracing for the door at the end of the hallway, the one that used to open into my room. Just days before, my life had felt like the opposite of this decay. My office perched high above Midtown Manhattan, glass stretching across the skyline, reflecting winter sunlight that sliced the air into silver shards. The hum of the city below had always steadied me, taxis, sirens, conversations blending into a rhythm that made sense. Inside that tower, everything obeyed rules. Deadlines, ledgers, lines on a screen. I had built a world of balance sheets and figures that didn't lie. People did. But numbers stayed loyal. That morning, the surface of my desk was cluttered with audit files, neatly stacked in disciplined rows. Ink, paper, precision. I had been tracing a client's expense flow, my pen gliding across a spreadsheet filled with predictable logic. Then came the vibration against my wrist, the sharp buzz of my phone, jarring in the quiet. The name on the screen stopped me cold, Ardan Hail. For a heartbeat, I almost didn't answer. It had been months since we'd spoken, and even then, only in short exchanges about birthdays or weather. But something about the timing, the weight of her name blinking in that sterile office light, made me swipe the call through. Ardan, she said. Her voice was soft, thinner than memory, threaded with exhaustion but steady like someone trying not to cry. Your grandfather passed this morning. The world around me seemed to contract, sound falling away until all I could hear was the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple, the familiar ache blooming behind my eyes. It wasn't grief, not the sharp, consuming kind that demands tears. It was something older, duller, a fracture reopening, one I thought had long since healed. Memories flickered in pieces, Grandpa sitting by the window with his radio, the smell of motor oil on his hands, his laugh low and genuine. He'd been the one who slipped me cash when Dad wasn't looking, the one who told me leaving this town wasn't betrayal but survival. And now, he was gone. Just like that, no warning, no final words, only a voicemail that would live on some server forever. I remembered staring out my window after hanging up, the skyline blurring into streaks of steel and fog. Cars crawled below like veins of light, alive, indifferent. The city didn't stop for anyone's death. It never had. I sat there, hands motionless on the keyboard, as the numbers on my screen turned meaningless. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the flight home wasn't about paying respects. It was about confrontation, one long delayed. Now, as I stood at the top of those stairs, staring down the dark hallway of my childhood home, that same numb certainty settled into my bones. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to settle the unfinished ledger between blood and truth. Grandpa had always been the one to teach me that truth lived in the fine print. Long before I ever sat behind a desk, he'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee beside his hand, the afternoon light catching the curve of his glasses. He'd slide his scratched pocket magnifier toward me, the metal cool against the wood, and say in that calm, unhurried voice, "Details matter more than promises, Ardan. Promises are air. Details are anchors." I didn't understand the weight of that lesson then, not really. But somewhere between the ink and the silence, I learned how to see the spaces where lies like to hide. Her voice on the phone trembled slightly, the edges worn thin by loss. "The memorial is Saturday," she said, each syllable measured, as though speaking too quickly might break something fragile between us. "You need to come home." The request, no, the order, caught somewhere between my chest and throat, a pressure I couldn't swallow. Columbus had become a word I avoided, a place sealed inside me like an attic door nailed shut. Every memory tied to it was wrapped in dust, left to rot quietly in the dark. 11 years had passed since I'd crossed the city limits, and that absence hadn't been chance, it was strategy. I'd built an entire life on distance. I had made my vow the morning I left, one hand gripping scholarship papers that smelled faintly of ink and hope, the other clutching a one-way ticket out. I can still feel the hum of that bus engine vibrating through the floor, the smell of diesel and rain. I watched the house shrink through the window, the porch light glowing faintly like it didn't realize no one was coming back. "I don't know if I can," I said finally, the words escaping colder, flatter, than I intended. The line was silent for a long moment. I could almost hear her shifting the phone, maybe closing her eyes, choosing her next words carefully. When she spoke again, the softness in her tone wasn't comfort, it was a warning disguised as affection. "You need to see this with your own eyes." Something in the way she said this made my pulse quicken. It wasn't only sorrow, there was an edge beneath it, like she was reaching through static, trying to hand me something invisible but urgent. That tremor in her voice dug under my skin. I turned my chair toward the window, letting my gaze fall over the skyline. The city stretched endlessly, its glass towers catching the last of the evening light, a field of reflections and motion. Down below, yellow cabs threaded through traffic like veins of light, each one pulsing with purpose. This was the world I had fought for, structured, relentless, exact. Every inch of it had been earned through calculation, through control. New York was order incarnate. Going back meant stepping into the chaos I'd spent my adult life escaping. That house wasn't just a building, it was a ledger of all the choices I'd refused to make, all the things I'd left unspoken. Even before the call ended, my hands were moving on their own, typing, clicking, navigating the airline website I knew by heart. Each confirmation prompt felt heavier than the last. Departure, LaGuardia. Destination, Columbus. 2 hours. That was all it would take to undo more than a decade of carefully maintained distance. I stared at the itinerary on the screen, the pale glow reflecting off the window glass. I should have hesitated longer, maybe thought through the reasons why she wanted me there. But curiosity, that old inheritance from him, wouldn't let go. When I stood, the office around me looked sterile, metal, glass, light humming low in the ceiling. On the corner of my desk sat a photo I kept hidden under a file, me at 16, standing beside Grandpa, both of us squinting at the camera under a bright Ohio sun. His arm draped across my shoulder. I turned it face down. Packing didn't take long. I folded the black suit carefully, the fabric smooth beneath my hands, and slid it into a small bag along with a handful of essentials. The folder went in last, the one filled with documents no one else had ever seen, papers tied to a truth I hadn't yet spoken aloud. As I zipped the bag closed, I caught my reflection in the dark window, tired, cautious, the city lights painting thin lines across my face. 2 hours from now, I'd be heading toward everything I'd tried to forget. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether I was running toward the past or walking straight into it. Because even before I packed that bag, I'd known deep down that this trip wasn't about mourning. Grief was just the disguise it wore. What waited in that house had teeth-old wounds dressed in polite silence. I told myself I came for closure, but the truth was more complicated, rooted in something darker, heavier. After dinner, the air turned still. The kind of stillness that hums beneath the skin, not calm but coiled. Here, quiet didn't mean rest, it meant unease wearing the mask of normalcy. The television droned faintly in the next room, voices blending into static. Somewhere glass clinked against wood, followed by the pop of a bottle cap and the dull scrape of a chair leg on tile. My father's voice rumbled through the house, low and jagged, each word dragged through liquor and bitterness. The sound of it filled every corner, settling like dust in the lungs. The space they'd given me wasn't a room so much as a forgotten corner, a converted storage closet behind the stairs. The smell of mildew lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of varnish and age. A pull-out couch sat wedged between stacks of boxes, each one marked with faded handwriting, camping gear, tools, old uniforms. On top of one lay a cracked picture frame, the glass long gone. I recognized the faint outline of a ribbon and a younger version of him, proud and upright, before time and whiskey softened the edges. I sat on the edge of the mattress, its springs groaning in protest, staring at the ceiling where water stains bloomed like bruises. Every instinct told me to grab my bag, call for a cab, and check into a hotel downtown. But I stayed. Maybe out of stubbornness, maybe because leaving would have felt like surrender. Some part of me needed to measure the damage, to see, with my own eyes, how deep the decay had gone. It didn't take long. By 11, the house had sunk into its familiar nighttime rhythm, the television still murmuring, a faucet dripping somewhere, the faint whir of the refrigerator struggling to stay alive. Then came the sound of uneven footsteps in the hallway. Heavy. Slow. A stagger more than a stride. I knew that sound, it carried years of memory and the unmistakable cadence of a man who'd finished another bottle. The shadows under the door shifted, his presence blotting out the faint light from the hall. Still awake, princess? He slurred, the nickname twisting into something cruel. His tone sliced through the quiet, laced with mockery and the sour breath of cheap whiskey. I didn't answer. The hinges groaned as the door inched open, and he filled the doorway, eyes gleaming in the half-light. He leaned against the frame, one hand bracing himself, the other still clutching a bottle by the neck. You think you can just walk back in after more than a decade and act like you belong here? The words came thick, deliberate, each one a challenge. I stood, the small room shrinking around us. My pulse pounded in my ears, but my voice stayed level. I don't have to act, I said quietly. I know exactly where I stand. The moment stretched, then broke. His hand shot forward, faster than memory could catch up. The slap cracked through the room, bright and sharp as gunfire. My head snapped sideways, heat blooming across my cheek, a metallic tang coating my tongue. For a second, everything went white, my vision narrowing to a pulse of pain. I steadied myself, refusing to look away. The bottle in his hand wobbled slightly as he smirked, satisfied. Then movement at the edge of the light caught my eye. In the doorway stood my mother. Her shadow wavered in the glow from the hall, one arm wrapped around the frame as if she needed it to stand. Her face was pale, eyes glassy, mouth parted but silent. For an instant, I thought she might speak, step between us, say something, anything. Instead, she turned her face aside, the gesture small but final. Her hand fell away from the frame, and she disappeared back into the dark without a word. The sound of her retreating footsteps was softer than a whisper, yet somehow heavier than his blow. The room stayed silent except for the faint clink of glass as he set the bottle down. My cheek throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat, but beneath the pain was something steadier, colder, unyielding. I tasted blood and swallowed it down, letting the burn remind me why I had come back in the first place. This house had taken enough from me. By morning, it would take nothing else. "It's late," she whispered, the sound fraying at the edges like paper worn thin. "You'll wake the neighbors." Her words trembled, not from fear of noise, but from what silence would bring after. She hesitated just long enough for her shadow to flicker across the hallway, then vanished behind the bedroom door. The latch clicked softly, final and deliberate, as if that small motion could wipe away what she'd just witnessed. The quiet that followed sank into the walls, dense and cold. It pressed against my ribs, thicker than anger, sharper than shame. The sting on my face pulsed in rhythm with the ticking clock on the mantel, each beat another reminder that her retreat had cut deeper than his hand ever could. I lowered myself to the couch, the old fabric exhaling dust, the springs sighing beneath me like a tired witness. Years of discipline rose from muscle memory. Breathing slowed. Heart steady. Focus narrow. The part of me trained to survive reawakened with mechanical precision. I lifted my phone from the armrest, its glow pale against the darkness, and opened the front camera. The reflection stared back, harsh light revealing the swelling on my skin. I angled the lens, turned my head slightly, captured it from every necessary perspective. Documentation wasn't revenge, it was survival. Opening the encrypted channel from my firm, I uploaded each image, adding precise annotations: time, location, description, emotional state, factual, detached. Habit kept the motions efficient. A soft chime confirmed the entry's submission. "Always record everything," my grandfather's voice echoed from memory, calm and absolute. "Evidence doesn't lie when people do. Keep your truth locked tight." For a moment, I studied the face on the screen, jaw tense, eyes hard, no trace of hesitation. The person looking back wasn't the one who'd left all those years ago, still trying to earn softness from people who mistook it for weakness. The reflection now was unyielding. Older, but not fragile. Changed, but not defeated. I closed the file, slid the phone beneath the pillow, and lay still. The ceiling loomed above, faint lines of light cutting through the blinds, tracing thin silver bars across the room. Sleep didn't come. The air smelled faintly of alcohol, old varnish, and dust, scents that belonged to this house long before I returned. Somewhere beyond the wall, a door slammed. Pipes groaned. Then stillness again. The blow hadn't been a punishment, it was a test, a crude way to reassert dominance. But it backfired. All it did was cement my resolve. The place that once felt like exile had become the stage for reckoning. By dawn, grey light seeped into the corners, washing the color from everything it touched. The pull-out's thin sheet clung damply to my skin, the air heavy with the scent of stale smoke. I sat up, feeling the dull ache in my cheek, and listened to the faint creak of the house waking up, a refrigerator hum, a bird tapping at the window, the groan of old wood adjusting to morning chill. In the kitchen, chaos reigned beneath a veneer of order. The table overflowed with neglected correspondence, envelopes yellowed at the edges, bank seals unbroken, government warnings folded beneath advertisements promising low-interest miracles. I pulled the nearest stack toward me and began sorting with clinical care. Electricity bills bearing final notices. Mortgage arrears marked in heavy red. Property taxes threatening seizure. Each document screamed quiet desperation. Mom appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her faded robe, slippers dragging against the linoleum. Her eyes widened when she saw what I was doing. For a second, she looked like she might scold me, then thought better of it. "Ardan," she said softly, almost pleading. "Leave those. Your father takes care of the finances." I lifted one sheet from the pile, holding it where the light caught the signature at the bottom. "Does he?" I asked evenly. The scrawl was familiar but wrong, an imitation, careful yet clumsy. I'd seen her handwriting hundreds of times before, neat, deliberate, patient. This one bore none of that grace. It was heavy-handed, trembling, the ink pressed too deep into the paper as if trying to prove its legitimacy through force alone. Her gaze flickered toward it, then away. "He said," she began, but the rest of the sentence faltered, her lips tightening. The silence between us was thick, the kind of silence that holds entire truths unspoken. I placed the paper gently on the table, aligning it with the rest of the stack. Around us, the morning light grew stronger, slicing through the blinds, exposing everything it touched. Nothing in that kitchen looked innocent anymore, not the bills, not the silence, not the woman standing there pretending not to see. "Did you sign this loan renewal?" My voice was quiet, measured, the kind of tone I used when I already knew the answer. Her gaze didn't meet mine. Instead, it drifted toward the coffee pot, watching it percolate like it might offer her an escape. "He said we needed it for repairs," she murmured, hands trembling as she reached for a chipped mug that had seen too many mornings like this. "He told you that?" I pressed gently, though every word felt like glass in my throat. "So, you didn't sign it yourself?" She hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing her features before she swallowed hard. The silence stretched. That was answer enough. From the living room came his voice, loud, dismissive, steeped in the confidence of a man who'd spent years rewriting truth to fit his comfort. "Don't start with your big city suspicion games," he barked, like the phrase alone could erase accountability. "This place needed work, and I handled it. New garage, new office, things cost money." I turned my head slightly, letting his words hang in the air as my eyes traveled past him to the window. Outside, sunlight caught on the warped siding of the so-called renovations. The garage he bragged about was nothing more than a bloated metal shell crowding the property line, its frame uneven, its purpose questionable. Half the yard had vanished beneath concrete. The office looked like a shed built in haste, dressed up with cheap siding and dollar store paint. The craftsmanship my father once took pride in, measured joints, smooth varnish, steady alignment, was gone, replaced by shortcuts and hollow gestures. "You call this fixing?" I muttered under my breath, but he only tilted his head back, swallowed another gulp from his bottle, and let a mocking smile curl across his face. The amber liquid sloshed near the rim as he waved the drink lazily, pretending the conversation was beneath him. By noon, the kitchen table was an evidence board. I'd already filled half a folder, scanning every statement, every renewal, capturing clear photos from multiple angles. Each file got tagged, dated, and uploaded. The trail was forming, piece by piece, lines of ink telling a story of neglect disguised as maintenance. Yet the puzzle still lacked one crucial piece, proof of where the money had gone once the checks cleared. That clue arrived from across the street. Mrs. Patterson caught me before I reached the gate, her small frame bundled in a knitted shawl despite the warm breeze. She looked older, of course, her hair now silver, her movements careful, but her eyes still carried the same sharpness that used to catch me sneaking cookies from her kitchen when I was 10. "I shouldn't get involved," she whispered, glancing nervously toward our porch. "But someone has to keep records." She pressed a thin envelope into my hand, her fingers trembling. The paper was soft from being handled too many times. Inside, a collection of photographs, each one more painful than the last. My breath caught as I flipped through them. Our front lawn turned marketplace. Card tables loaded with what had once made this house ours. My father's rare coin collection, meticulously catalogued during my childhood, spread across plastic trays under a handwritten garage sale sign. My grandmother's porcelain tea set, the one she'd carried across states, reduced to a mismatched display in cardboard boxes. Even my childhood sketches, bent, stained, stacked like junk. "He said it was storage stuff," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her lips pressed into a thin line. But I knew better. I recognized those things. The photos blurred for a moment as I blinked hard, fury tightening my chest until it was difficult to breathe. They weren't clearing space, they were stripping the past bare, piece by piece. Selling memory. Selling legacy. Selling everything that had ever meant something in this house. I slid the pictures carefully into my folder, tucking them beside the fraudulent signatures and overdue statements. Together, they formed a story impossible to deny, a story of betrayal, debt, and quiet destruction hidden behind suburban calm. But stories needed witnesses. That's how I found myself standing outside a small law office 2 blocks from the courthouse. The building was old, its bricks darkened by rain and time. The brass plate beside the door read Jonathan Morrison, attorney at law. The letters were faded but firm, like the man who appeared as I stepped inside. He rose from behind a heavy oak desk, his frame still straight despite his age. 60, maybe older. His hair was thinning, combed neatly, his tie slightly askew in a way that suggested he'd been working since dawn. "Your grandmother called ahead," he said, voice low and steady, extending his hand. The grip was firm, reassuring. "Told me you'd be bringing something important." I took the seat he gestured to, the leather creaking beneath me. Setting the folder on his desk, I began to spread its contents: bills, loan renewals, pawn slips, and the photographs Mrs. Patterson had given me. He leaned forward, glasses sliding down his nose as he studied each document with careful precision. His pen scratched softly against a yellow legal pad, marking dates, cross-referencing figures, connecting patterns invisible to anyone without a trained eye. The longer he read, the deeper the lines etched across his brow. The only sounds in the room were the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the steady rhythm of his note-taking. After several minutes, he exhaled a long, quiet breath that carried the weight of confirmation. "You were right to come," he said finally, not looking up yet. "This goes beyond bad bookkeeping." He tapped the page once, the ink smudging faintly beneath his thumb. "If what you've shown me is complete, your father's not just in debt. He's in violation of at least 3 federal statutes." His eyes lifted to meet mine, then, calm, deliberate, but laced with something else: resolve. "And if we move carefully," he continued, "we might be able to reclaim what's left before it all disappears for good." Finally, he looked up from the scattered sheets. "This is substantial," he said, tapping the binder with a deliberate rhythm. His grey eyes scanned me for confirmation. "You co-signed the original mortgage with your mother?" "Yes," I replied, the memory crisp in my mind. 19 years old, freshly out of military training, armed with a scholarship that had carried me across state lines and into a life I'd carefully constructed. I had known just enough about contracts to shield us from overreach. Back then, I'd inserted a clause: no major modifications without the agreement of both signatories. A safeguard. Morrison's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile appearing. "That clause, it's still binding," he said, admiration in his tone. Then his gaze shifted to the refinancing documents. "These signatures, not yours, and I'd wager not your mother's either." "There is," I said flatly, letting the weight of the words settle. He leaned back, folding his hands across his chest, eyes narrowing in careful consideration. "Then we have grounds for an emergency injunction," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We can petition the court to freeze all property transfers and require judicial oversight before any movement occurs. It will buy time, and prevent him from liquidating assets before we can intervene." The afternoon arrived quickly, the sunlight harsh on the courthouse steps. Judge Harrison waited inside, a man whose presence alone conveyed authority. Sharp glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his posture rigid, voice steady, each syllable deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, it didn't need to be raised. Respect hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Morrison handed the judge the binder, layered carefully. On top, my photographs of the bruise, time-stamped and annotated. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each turn. Lines etched at his temples deepened as he read the accounts, the evidence, the clear chain of forged documents. "Injunction granted," he said finally, signing the order with a swift, authoritative stroke. "No sale, no transfer, no disposal of any assets until further review. Miss Hale, you will have lawful access to secure the property, accompanied by sheriff deputies." The words struck me like the fall of a gavel in a silent cathedral. This was no longer private ugliness masquerading as family drama. It was law, tangible and inescapable. Outside the courtroom, Morrison handed me a fresh copy of the order, the edges crisp, the ink still glinting under the afternoon light. "The sheriff will meet us tomorrow morning. Be prepared." "He won't accept this quietly," Morrison warned, voice low but firm, the caution etched into every syllable. I folded the papers meticulously, sliding them into my bag alongside the deed I had carried for years, proof kept like a talisman. Now, that evidence transformed into a weapon. Every precaution, every signature, every note had been preserved. The line had been drawn: my house, my rules, and now, the full authority of the state of Ohio reinforced them. Later, at the hotel, I organized the injunction papers on the desk, spreading them out to review once more. My thoughts were interrupted by the phone, the screen flashing an unfamiliar number. I answered, and a clipped, worried voice came through. "Ardan, I thought you should know," said Mrs. Davies, the elementary school principal where my mother still worked. Her words were deliberate, each syllable carrying concern, urgency threaded between the pauses. I listened, the weight of anticipation settling deeper into my chest. Even here, hundreds of miles from the home I'd left behind, the threads of the past were pulling taut. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight, the pieces were arranged, evidence aligned, strategy forming. I stared out at the city lights from the hotel window, the streets below a blur of movement and purpose, thinking of the home that awaited me, the house that was mine, finally backed by law, and ready to be reclaimed. "Your father just made a scene here." The words barely reached me before I had the engine running. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold beneath my fingers, and pulled away, tires crunching over the gravel driveway. By the time I arrived at the school, the aftermath was already unfolding. Clusters of staff lingered near the entrance, faces tight with whispered concern. A security guard shifted his weight from foot to foot, his gaze tracking every passing vehicle. The front doors had been locked and reopened, the lobby echoing with fragments of arguments that had already passed into rumor. Inside, I found my mother in the main office. Her skin had taken on a mottled hue, red blotches spreading across her cheeks like watercolor stains. She clutched a stack of folders to her chest, fingers pressing hard as if the paper could shield her from the humiliation. Her lips were pressed in a thin line, and the edges of her eyes glistened faintly under the fluorescent lights. From the hallway came his voice again, loud and abrasive, cutting through the quiet like a saw. He was pacing, gesturing wildly, railing about ungrateful daughters, stolen property, imagined betrayals. Mrs. Davies crouched slightly to my level, her tone low but steady. "We had to escort him out," she said, eyes flicking toward the doorway as if he might return at any second. I glanced at my mother, but she didn't meet my gaze. Her hands, trembling, fidgeted with the edges of the folders as though smoothing the paper could erase what had happened. The weight of shame was etched into her shoulders, dragging her down. "This isn't just my fight anymore," I murmured, voice soft but firm. My words seemed to reach her through the tremor in her chest. For the first time that day, the rigid mask she wore began to crack. Her lips pressed together tightly, a fissure forming in years of practiced silence. Later, at the hotel, there was a knock at my door. She stood there, carrying nothing but a small leather purse and a gaze I had never seen before. Defeat sat beside her, but beneath it, there was something sharper, a thread of resolve woven through resignation. "I can't live like this," she whispered, voice breaking. "Everyone saw. He made me small in front of people I've known for 15 years. I gestured to the folder Morrison had prepared, setting it carefully on the desk. The restoration agreement lay within, crisp and orderly, its clauses precise and protective. The document reinstated the house to its original ownership structure and blocked further unauthorized loans or transfers. "Your mother retains lifetime residency," I explained quietly, "but Rick's control ends here." Her fingers hovered over the pen, hesitation visible in the slight shake of her hand. "If he finds out," I added, "he already knows his losing." Time stretched. Her gaze drifted to the document, then back to mine. Finally, she lowered her hand and began to sign. Each stroke was uncertain, tremulous, but they cut through years of enforced silence, a reclamation inked in small, deliberate movements. When she slid the papers back across the table, I felt something subtle but undeniable shift in the room. Not a triumph, not yet, but a fracture in the wall he had constructed around her, a first fissure in his dominion. She wiped her eyes swiftly. "Don't tell him I signed tonight," she said. I nodded. For now, the secrecy mattered more than celebration. One page, one act, one crack in his control. The next morning, the sound of the contractor's hammers and saws filled the hollowed house. Dust danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through broken blinds and bare windows, transforming the space into something fragile, broken, yet stirring with new life. I moved through each room with James, the lead carpenter, pointing out where my father's craftsmanship had been stripped or replaced by shoddy work. In the basement, James tapped on a wall stud. "Doesn't sound right," he murmured. Moments later, plaster crumbled to reveal a narrow compartment I had never known existed. Inside, a bundle of papers and an envelope marked with my name awaited. I sank onto the worn steps, hands trembling as I unfolded the letter. My father's handwriting, precise and deliberate, spilled across the page, a mixture of pride and caution, instructions and reminders, warnings about protecting the house, and please not to allow it to fall into the wrong hands. Reading his words, I felt the weight of legacy settle on my shoulders, a mixture of love, responsibility, and the undeniable pull of family history. It was a gift and a charge, a roadmap back to the home I had fled, and a reminder that reclaiming it would demand more than papers, it would require courage. "This place is more than wood and nails, Ardan. It's our history. Guard it." The letter trembled in my hands, ink smudged by tears that blurred the careful lines, but for the first time in over a decade, I felt his presence beside me. Not as a memory, not as a shadow, but as a weight that pressed against my chest with familiarity and warmth. His voice, deliberate, steady, lingered in my mind, stitching threads of the past into the present. That evening, the quiet hum of restoration was broken by a sharp knock at the front door. I opened it to find Katie Williams, her expression calm, professional, and determined. She was dressed in simple civilian clothes, carrying a small, unassuming box that somehow seemed heavier than it appeared. "I served with your dad," she said quietly, setting the box down on the porch rail. "He trusted me to hold these for you and your mother if anything happened." I followed her inside, anticipation mingling with unease. She opened the box carefully, revealing journals bound in worn leather, stacks of photographs, and a watch gleaming faintly under the dim light of the hall. My breath caught. Each item carried its own story, its own proof of a life I'd barely glimpsed before leaving. Her gaze met mine evenly, unflinching. "There were rumors," she said softly, almost apologetically. "Rick twisted them to suit himself. But your father never betrayed the family. He spoke of you and Lydia constantly. He loved both of you fiercely, in ways he rarely expressed aloud." Mom appeared in the doorway, hesitant, shadows darkening her expression. Katie handed her a sealed envelope. With trembling hands, my mother broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she read, each line softening her posture, easing the tension that had weighed her down for years. Her shoulders relaxed, her lips parted in a small, almost imperceptible sigh. When she finally looked up, her voice was trembling, fragile yet resolute. "Your father never left us, Ardan." "I did," I admitted, the admission heavy on my tongue, "but I want to come back." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. The letter was still warm, the words inside carrying more than ink, they carried the pulse of a man who had fought for us silently, a legacy we hadn't realized was always within reach. Between the sawdust, the hammer strikes, and the tangible memory of him etched into the walls, something inside both of us began to mend, tentative but undeniable. Meanwhile, in Morrison's office, the evidence of betrayal was laid bare. Receipts, pawn slips, and forged signatures were scattered across the polished desk, forming a map of recklessness and deceit. Every calculated lie, every hidden transaction my father had never sanctioned, now lay exposed under the bright fluorescent lights. Morrison slid the folder forward during the plea negotiations, voice calm but unwavering. "You've run out of ground to stand on." My father's bravado faltered. The sneers, the bluster, even the intoxicated confidence he had wielded like a weapon, all of it dissipated under the weight of documentation, witness accounts, and irrefutable proof. He slumped into the chair, shoulders bowed, eyes flickering with realization and defeat. The terms were read aloud with judicial precision: full restitution of assets, signed confession acknowledging forgery and misappropriation, compliance with all protective clauses in the restoration agreement. Every motion, every word, was a nail driven into the false foundation he had spent years building. I watched, steady and measured, as the last shred of his control slipped from his grasp. In that moment, the house, the papers, and the legacy of my father's true intentions finally converged. What had been broken, scattered, and violated began to align again, not entirely healed, but undeniably set on a course toward restoration. And outside, through the open windows, the first hint of sunset caught the dust motes in the air, painting the rooms gold. The house was alive again, breathing in sunlight and possibility, carrying with it the echoes of memory, justice, and the fragile beginnings of peace. Prison time. The concept hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and inescapable. He tried to glance at Mom for sympathy, searching her face for a flicker of concern, but her gaze remained steadfastly downcast, lips pressed tight, hands clenched around her chair. When the pen finally touched paper, it was as if a weight had lifted, not from him, but from all of us. The first honest act he had made in years. Days passed. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Dad's army buddies began appearing at the doorstep, one after another. Each carried relics of the past he had tried to erase, a medal nestled in a velvet-lined box, the gleam of a combat knife, a field jacket still infused with the dry, dusty scent of distant deployments. Their footsteps were quiet on the porch, their hands steady as they laid each artifact on the dining table. Shaking my hand with a gravity that spoke more than words, one of the men murmured, "He told us lies, but your father's truth is safe now." Community support poured in alongside the military brothers. Neighbors arrived with casseroles still warm, small bundles of handwritten letters, anecdotes, and gentle encouragement. Every plate, every story, every hand extended in kindness chipped away at the shadow Rick had cast across our lives. For the first time since returning, the weight of fear and isolation lifted. We weren't alone, and the house, once hollowed by neglect, felt like it might finally breathe again. That evening, I sat with Mom at the kitchen table, the signed restoration agreement spread between us, alongside the folded letter I had kept in my pocket for years. Its edges soft from handling, the paper seemed to hum with intent. "You'll have lifetime residency here," I said gently. "This will always be your home. But there are rules now, boundaries. No one will dictate what happens under this roof again." Her eyes shimmered with unspilled tears. She nodded once, faint but resolute. "I understand," she whispered. And I believed her. Rebuilding the house was one thing, hammer, saw, and nail, but restoring the family, the rhythm of shared life, would take longer. Yet, at least now, we had a foundation strong enough to try. 3 weeks later, the house was no longer a ruin. The living room held standing shelves, crafted with the precision and care my father had once poured into each joint. Floors gleamed with restored oak, their warm tones catching sunlight streaming through the windows. Even the dining table, sanded and polished, was ready to host life instead of neglect. That evening, Mom and I set the table together. Gone were the takeout cartons, the microwaved dinners eaten in silence. She had prepared pot roast, roasted potatoes, and green beans, simple, familiar dishes steeped in the rituals of family dinners past. We ate slowly, savoring each bite, but more than that, we savored the quiet dignity of sitting down as mother and daughter without fear, without interruption. Afterward, I pulled my laptop onto the couch, finishing a report for my firm. New York remained my world, bustling and demanding, but now Columbus had a place in it, too. This house would not be abandoned. I would oversee it, maintaining its care, ensuring it remained a sanctuary, a testament to the resilience of family. Perhaps one day, it would be rented to a trustworthy family, but always, I would hold it in readiness, proof that ownership is not just legal, but lived and honored. Later, we stepped onto the porch together. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the neighbor's yard and the first coolness of autumn settling over Columbus. Stars stretched across the sky, brilliant and unbroken, mirrored in the calm of our restored sanctuary. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of belonging not just to a house, but to a life rebuilt, piece by piece, with care, courage, and unwavering patience. Mom's hand brushed mine lightly. I squeezed it, silent acknowledgement passing between us. The past had been claimed, the house reclaimed, and for the first time, the future felt within reach. I poured us each a small glass of wine, the deep red catching the evening light and shimmering like liquid garnet. Raising mine, I let my gaze drift from Mom's face to the house behind us, now glowing with warmth and quiet purpose, the windows casting golden rectangles onto the freshly swept lawn. To Dad, I murmured softly, voice almost lost in the gentle evening breeze, for building more than a home, for building something worth protecting. The words felt weighty, carrying the ghosts of past struggles, the echoes of lost years, and the promise of a future reclaimed. Mom lifted her glass, hesitated for a heartbeat, and then touched it gently to mine. Her smile was delicate, almost cautious, but unmistakably real, a glimmer of hope shining through lines of hardship and worry. The faint scent of lavender lingered around her, mingling with the crisp, earthy aroma of freshly cut grass. I sipped slowly, the wine warming my chest as I let the gravity of the moment sink in. The wind stirred lightly, brushing strands of hair across our faces, carrying the distant hum of the city mingled with the occasional chirp of crickets. Everything felt suspended, a rare bubble of stillness after years of tension, fear, and chaos. Behind us, the house stood resolute, its silhouette outlined by soft light spilling from the windows, each beam a testament to resilience and care. The newly polished floors, restored shelves, and repaired walls were more than wood and paint, they were a declaration of survival, a canvas of memory preserved and renewed. I glanced at Mom again. Her eyes shimmered with quiet pride, a mixture of relief and recognition that the weight we'd carried for so long had shifted. Our hands brushed briefly, a simple gesture loaded with unspoken understanding. The sun sank lower, the sky deepening into hues of amber and violet, and the first stars began to appear, faint yet certain. I felt a tether between past and present, a continuity that stretched through memory, struggle, and finally reclamation. We stood together, glass in hand, and for the first time in a very long while, the air between us was free of tension, heavy only with gratitude and the shared knowledge that what we had fought for, both tangible and unseen, was finally ours to keep. I took another slow sip, savoring the wine and the moment alike, and in that quiet evening light, the house behind us wasn't just a building. It was proof that endurance could prevail, that love and courage could rebuild even what seemed irrevocably broken.